Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here today. My name is Julian Gregory, and I'm the tenor in the King Singers, for those of you who aren't familiar with the group. And I'd like now to introduce my colleague, my bass colleague, Johnny. So let's see if this works.
And as if by magic, I appear on screen. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Jules. And it is delightful to be back with you all again for another workshop as part of our new music prize. And then the purpose of these is, of course, to try and give you some extra kernels of wisdom, some extra tools to be able to create something, to compose something that you are really happy with and which can serve the power of music to bring people together in the most effective way possible. Now, our guest today is a total legend. Aside from being one of our favorite people in the entire world, he also was a King singer for 12 years between 1985 and 1997. He is an extraordinarily prolific composer of brilliant choral music. He's composed for all kinds of choirs, written a huge amount for children's choirs, for adult choirs, for the King singers. He is a world-renowned clinician and conductor, and just essentially a wonderful, wonderful man. He is, of course, Bob Chilcott. And today in this session, we're going to be talking about lots of things to do with composing. Specifically, we're going to be talking about line, shape, and structure. But we're also going to be talking about the differences between writing for a larger SATB choir and writing for a smaller ensemble with one voice per part, like the King Singers, and seeing what challenges are presented when you're doing different kinds of composition. Without further ado, let's bring him in. Bob, where are you? Are you there?
Hey, Johnny.
Hey,
nice to see you guys.
Did I say everything okay? I didn't mortally offend you.
I wondered who we were talking about for a minute. Thank you so much. I feel rather, I sang in the group for 12 years, but when I'm sitting here, when Julian is there, who I think is a fantastic tenor, I kind of feel a little bit humbled, thinking that I myself might have been a tenor. I've always thought, tenor is not an appropriate word for me. I'm a kind of fiver now. On a good day, I'm a kind of well, there we are. Anyway, I did, like you, want to say good evening in England to everyone who's watching, and to you, of course, too. I know you're in London. I'm just outside Oxford, and in the Cotswolds, and it's pretty miserable here today. But it's so nice. You brightened up the evening here, and if you're watching from the US, good. I suppose it's around midday. So hope that it's doing well where you are, and I'll see if I can say a few things that might be of some value. But
stop being so condemning. Everything you say will be of wonderful substance. And just a quick word to everyone watching. You can see there's the chat here. Please, if you have any questions, do post them in the chat, and we will try to address as many of them as possible over the course of this hour. So if anything, no question is too silly or too stupid, please do write in, and we'll see if we can get to it.
Thank you, Johnny. It occurred to me, I've written music all my life, but I was a performer for a long time, as you know. So I really did sing. I sang as a freelance singer in London, and then I sang in the King Singers. And really, I think my writing has been so much informed by my work as a performer. And I think from the King Singers' point of view, the really important thing from that point of view that I take with me always in terms of my writing is the way that the group has always firstly tried to communicate. And it's all about communicating not only sound, but communicating meaning and words, and making things, bringing people into this kind of singing world, and world of stories and pictures and color and all sorts of ideas. And I think for me that's been one of the most important things in my writing career, and I think it's something that the group has always done so well and continues to do. I mean, you communicate on such a great level, and I think for anyone thinking of writing for singers, that's for a singer, if they can take something that they feel they can add their own way of telling the story that the composer is trying to tell, that has to be a wonderful aim for the composer. And I thought a lot about that, because actually when any composer is faced with the idea of writing a piece, the first thing you think about, well, what am I going to do? It's what shall I, how do I see this piece? And there are several things that occur to me. And the first one really is the character of the piece that you want to kind of try and illuminate is the sound world of the piece. So actually the sound world that you imagine in your mind really is the first thing probably that comes to mind. What kind of sound world do I want to have? And I think about that a lot. Sometimes the sound world comes immediately, and other times it doesn't. You feel maybe in a quandary about what kind of world that wants to be. Does it want to be a world with a lot of movement, or a lot of stasis, or a lot of texture, or a lot of brightness, or it could be many different things. And I think composers, it's one of the things that is a very important thing to think about right from the beginning, the sound world, because that gives you the character, it gives you the color, it gives you your feeling for the nature of the text. And the reality is, if 10 composers write music to the same text, all those 10 composers are going to write different pieces, and they're going to inhabit different sound worlds too. So I think that's a really important thought from the beginning. And just another thing I would think about, because it's an important aspect too, is what kind of gesture do you want to make with the piece? Some people concentrate a lot on delivering a gesture to the listener or to the performer. Some openings of pieces have impact, and then you think, well, if the piece has impact, you've then got to construct a construction which is going to be able to take that impact. And then others will look at a way of entering a piece, and they'll draw people slowly into that world, and maybe it will reveal itself. I always thought, I remember once one of the, actually it was a guy in Germany who worked for BMG. He was a great guy. He always used to say, "Hi guys, welcome to the Pleasure Dome." That was always his big line. But I remember he came to a concert somewhere we did in Austria, I think it was, and he said he'd had a terrible day. And he thought, the last thing I want to do is go to a concert. And he sat down, and the group came on, and they sang a chord. And he said from the moment that chord happened, he was drawn into this world. And then slowly that world revealed itself to him. And he said it was like balm for his soul. Well, and I kind of think that that has got a lot to offer in terms of the way that you think about a composition, because drawing people into your world and into the story is a nice thing to do. It's like putting your feet into water and seeing how cold it is, and then slowly letting yourself be drawn into that water.
Would you mind just elaborating or just clarifying for me? So, just in terms of the word gesture, for me, it could mean two different things just on sort of what we're talking about. The first is kind of almost like the brush stroke. Do you want something to be which is kind of like very kind of, you know, if you talk about like say impact at the beginning and then that kind of unravels afterwards, or something with it open slowly? And then also something I tend to think about like the function of a piece in a concert, and also the flux of energy between audience and performer. And there are certain pieces which you really send out to the audience, and the energy is going out from you to the audience. And other pieces is where you're still and they are forced to come in. And for me, that constant flux of energy is what maintains the momentum and interest over the course of a 1 or 2 hour concert. But so is the gesture just, I might be neither of these things, but is gesture the kind of the symbiosis of those two things? Is it more the kind of the shape, the kind of the where the accents or the impact lies within a piece, or is it its function within a concert or in a space?
I think you've explained what you said extremely well. I think it is a combination of all those things, actually, because I think in terms of I think it is more the kind of physical nature of the piece. So that could be a gentle one or a very strong one. In a way, I'm thinking in terms too of what would you do if you were conducting a piece? How would you show this to your choir? And I think for someone, when you're studying a conducting score, you look immediately for the sense of what the composer is trying to put over. And a lot of the time when you have to teach that to somebody, you will use particular types of physical gesture to show that, or to impart that information. So the composer has to be quite clear about what kind of gesture they're making in terms of the piece. I think it's yes, it's all you said. and more, because I think it's having a lot of the time. I know a lot of conductors do this. They look at a piece and you immediately try and grasp what the composer is doing very quickly. You'll probably play it through or read it through, and you'll go from the beginning to the end quickly and try and immediately to get a grasp of what the feel of the piece is. And actually, the composer has to show that, I think, very clearly what they feel that is. So, because you need to give that information to the conductor or the performers or whatever. So I think it's thinking about things with clarity in that way. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally.
And then I suppose one thinks about the space that it's in. And I think I like the idea of well, the American composer, wonderful composer, Libby Larsen, who has written pieces for the group. Libby and I used to have the same publisher, and she used to come over to England and we used to meet, and she talked a lot about physical space. I was writing a concerto, actually. It was a long time ago, and I was stuck with it. You know, I was really stuck. And she was wonderful. She talked about physical space. And I think you have to think with a composition, however small it is or however large it is, you have to think about it inhabiting a physical space. Because the performer is in a physical space, so somehow the composer has to put themselves in that space too. I always think of, you know, Frank Gehry, of course, the architect who was a concert violinist. You know, I loved hearing him talk about his idea of what inhabits a space, and I think it's quite inspiring to think of structure and space in dimensions, because inside your head you can think about these spaces, and I think for a composer that's quite an exciting way of thinking of filling up space. It's a bit like your canvas. You know, if you're a painter, you have a physical space in front of you, even though the canvas is two-dimensional. You know what space has got to be filled up, and that can be quite helpful, I think, for a composer. If you look at the space from the beginning and think, actually, I don't know how big this is, or I don't know where it's going, it confuses your thinking. So I think to have a very clear idea of how you view the space, I think it's quite an important thing.
Well, I think that's a very interesting thing. I mean, from a programming point of view, of course, we really take the spaces into account when we're putting together a concert, not just in terms of making sure that sort of thematically it sits well with the space. You know, we're singing in a big old cathedral or monastery. We want to sing something which is maybe slightly more reflective, which echoes what's happening in the space. But of course, acoustics play a huge part in this as well. You know, if you've got something with a 9-second echo, we're not going to program a concert which is, you know, presto the whole way through with semiquaver movements, because the intricacies will be lost. So I think, you know, as we are here in 2020 and doing a lot of things virtually, what's interesting is that, you know, we don't yet know exactly, you know, how much we're going to perform any of these pieces that we've kind of been thinking about over the last year, and we've had recently written, but we're trying to do a lot more online. And of course, online, we don't have acoustics. We're sitting and singing into a microphone here. So you actually might think, okay, if I'm designing a piece for an online performance, maybe I move away from something that is incredibly static, with like big kind of claw clusters that are held for a long period of time. And I try to create kind of like a harmonic framework, which is constructed out of things which are maybe a bit, I don't know, more rhythmic or shorter term, because then they translate very, very well over a medium like this without an echo. I said that in a long-winded way, but I think that's a consideration one might take into account this year.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And because that leads on really to when you're setting language, looking at the nature of the piece, you have to think, well, is this piece something where language moves quickly or language moves very slowly? And that is a big factor, because of course syllabic music has a very different nature to very, very legato music with long vowels, and particularly when you're setting English, because English is such a mixture of so many languages. It really does change the nature and of the sound of the music. So I think a composer has to think very carefully about what is the nature of this text. Is it a percussive text? Is it a very vowel-driven text? Is it something that requires long lines or short lines? And so that's a big consideration too, because that will also give us the character of the piece. And of course, melodic shapes are completely governed by that perception. So I think it's important to think of the movement of the text and how that's going to impact.
Well, I remember we had a conversation, Bob, not long ago, also about how I suppose different music traditions have grown up with like different, you know, maybe sort of thinking horizontally about a piece of music versus thinking vertically. Sorry, you know, like yes. how we are informed maybe by the traditions in which we grow up as to whether we anticipate things being more polyphonic or homophonic, or kind of more tonal, or kind of simply metrical. I would be interested to, you know, I think there may be some people who are worried that they need to write in a certain style, you know, doing something which is maybe polyphonic, even though that's not what they've grown up in, or vice versa. And I wondered if you might be able to elaborate briefly, actually, on maybe the benefit of not thinking that way.
Yes, I think that's a very valid point, actually, Johnny, because to a certain extent, we all are informed musically by the kind of the musical experience that we've had. And if you look at the musical experience that perhaps you and I have had, singing in buildings with big acoustics, the nature of music that works better in that acoustic is linear music that moves with slower word movement. But if your experience as being singing in places with much less resonant acoustic, you might be in a situation there where, you know, homophonic, very vertical music works better. And I think, you know, if you go to a soccer match in England where people sing, the impact of hearing everyone singing the words at the same time and is very, very powerful. And I think homophonic music, having grown up in that sort of polyphonic tradition, which I love, of course, but I think homophonic music has a lot of power. And I think it can either slow or quick be very impactful for a text, because of course you're articulating as a body something that maybe a solo singer would sing, and you get a lot more clarity with that kind of text impact. So I think you're right. I think you have to do what feels right for you, and I like the kind of all different types of perspectives from that point of view. But I think it's what you have to look at, what serves the words in the best possible way. But that is a very valid point. And like most composers, you know, composers are quite fragile beings in a way, because, you know, it's very easy immediately to lose confidence with what you're doing, or to think, actually, I'd far rather do something like that someone else has done. But actually, I think one of the biggest hurdles you have to have is to say, this is me, and I'm going to deliver what I think is me, and I'm confident to do that. And I think it's important to do that. So I would encourage that in all cases.
May I just, there's a question that's come in, which I think could actually be interesting just to hear your quick thoughts on this too. And it's on the same idea. Philip Nix asks, speaking on structure and line, which is of course the subject of this, what are the pieces from years ago that you feel influence your writing today? And I just wonder, particularly in this nature, you know, as people like us who have grown up singing a lot of, say, polyphony in big cathedrals, are there any pieces of like incredibly powerful homophony, for instance, that you think it might be interesting for people to hear, or vice versa, where you think it really serves the piece well, or really served the kind of the moment in which the piece was performed?
That's an interesting point. Now, and a very good question, because we are all informed by, you know, I grew up singing in, you know, like a lot of people from a similar tradition did, singing English church music mainly. So a lot of Renaissance polyphony, which I found very hard to sing. So I didn't, actually, I think that had less of an impact on me than it does now, because I love listening to it now. I found as long as I didn't have to sing it, that was all right, because it's really hard to sing. And I didn't have that type of voice. So I found that hard. But I think probably the music that had the biggest impact for me was early 20th century English music, probably, but composers like Vaughan Williams and Stamford, and who wrote in a kind of well, they wrote with quite a lot of contrapuntal music, but not at the same time. The kind of discourse then was more about clarity of text. And then, of course, when you're my age, you know, I grew up with the Beatles and Elton John, you know, Elton John lived up the road from where I lived. And you know, we were very excited about the fact he played in the local pub. I mean, I was quite small when he played there, but so I didn't go. But you know, we were very influenced by that sort of storytelling, songwriting. I think I've heard other people similar sort of age to me say the same thing. It was such a very, very big thing that happened in music at the time that you can't help not being influenced by that. And I still am, actually. By that kind of storytelling, melodic line, and I think that's been a big influence. So the influence is quite broad, actually. You know, I think popular song has played a massive impact on the way people write for voices, and it certainly does now, which is no bad thing, I don't think.
Amazing.
Bob, I've got a question. Do you have a particularly favourite style and indeed acoustic set of acoustics that you like to write for the King Singers? You know, with in mind, bad grammar, sorry, but because you know, obviously having been in the group and having experienced all the various kinds of acoustics, is there one that has helped define your favourite kind of arranging or composing for the group?
For the group, I would say, for me, that the what I've enjoyed most in writing for the group, actually, in writing in general, I would say this. I've enjoyed writing secular music best because certainly for me, having grown up in this English church music tradition, I found the hardest type of music to write is music that is part of that tradition. Actually, the big liberating thing for me as a composer was writing when I started writing for children's voices, for young voices, because I suddenly was excited by the fact that I could write anything I wanted, and you could pick a text that perhaps you wouldn't pick for something for a mixed choir or for a church choir. You could pick a text and think, I'll have it. This music suggests different style to me, and I found that very, very liberating. And I also found it liberating writing for children, because you would write a piece, and it's always the same when you write for children, and when you conduct with children, which I've done a lot. I say children, I mean young people. You say, "Oh, take this piece," and they go, "Ugh." Or you say, "Take this piece," and they go, "Yes."
Yeah.
And it's what makes yes, and you think, I love that. It's particularly nice if they do that if it's one of your own pieces. I don't think they're always just being nice, but I've found that very liberating. So I think the pieces I've enjoyed writing most for the group have been the secular pieces. And that's because, in a way, it's given me a broader palette of idea. The piece I really enjoyed writing for the group was High Flight, because it, even though it was written to be performed in King's Chapel, which has a very big acoustic, I wanted to write this kind of quick, mobile music, and the group is so very good at that. It can articulate very well, and so I really enjoyed writing that. And also a piece that I wrote for the group a little while ago, which I had a lot of difficulty writing, was a piece called Swimming Over London, which was a kind of hybrid piece musically, and one that I had to suddenly go from this world of writing for choir into the Kingsinger's world, and I had to define it in my mind. Why do I find this so difficult? And I had to inhabit the vocal group world again. And it made me suddenly discover the difference between writing for choir and writing for vocal group. Because it's a bit like writing for orchestra and writing for string quartet. Because the one thing that completely changes the dynamic is that if you play in a string quartet or you sing in the Kingsingers, you are close enough to musically work in a completely reactive way. So because you don't have a conductor, you are defined, your own part is defined by what else is happening by your colleagues around you. And that is a very different thing from being in a choir, where you might be in a big group of people and you might be standing in the soprano section or in the bass section, and you can only hear what's going on in your part and you're following a conductor. It's a kind of different dynamic. And that was something it took me a while to realize that.
Well, it's funny. So I am one of the judges. I'm one of the 8 judges for this year's New Music Prize. Good luck to you all. But I think it's interesting when I think about what we can sometimes do in the Kingsingers versus what's sort of reasonable to expect from a much larger choir. I think the word agility is a word that I really, really like. You know, it's like any business. If you've got a business with 3,000 employees, to do one small change still requires a huge amount of work just to make that one small change possible. Whereas if you have a business of 6 people, one small change can be adopted in 10 seconds, 1 hour. And I think that when we're thinking about, I mean, I see if you agree, Bob, but I think when we're thinking about writing for different kinds of groups, I think just in virtue of the fact that we're only 6 people, irrespective of how good we are, that if you want to do something which is really, really quick with lots of rapid text delivery, you're much more likely to be able to achieve it with 6 people only standing very close than you are with 90. So for me, say as a judge looking at this, and I'm only one of 8, and there's no rule here, but I when looking, say, at the SATB entries, will think, you know, is this something which it's realistic to expect a choir? It's not about difficulty, but it's just about maneuvering such a large body of people in a way that both kind of honors the music and the text and is also like just simply doable. And I think that that's probably a key difference. You know, it's, as I say, it's in virtue of the fact that we're a sextet, not that we're a sextet and we're the Kingsingers, but does that word agility speak to you as well?
Totally. And I think it definitely makes sense when you think about Kingsingers repertoire that could be sung by choirs, because I know, as someone who was part of that process of trying to get publishing things going and all that sort of thing, there was very little of our repertoire that worked very well for choirs. You know, some things, there were a few pieces that worked really well. Now, for instance, the song "You Are the New Day," which a lot of Kingsingers fans will know, the main reason that worked simply was even though it's quite a mobile piece actually in its delivery, and that's a stylistic thing, but everyone is singing the words at the same time. It's like, and so it goes. Everyone is singing the words at the same time. That makes it easier. One that works very well actually as well is the piece "I'm a Train." You know, I've done that actually with choirs, and it works very well because everyone's singing the words at the same time, even though it is quite mobile. But a lot of the repertoire is much more reactive and conversational in Kingsingers. It might just be you have sort of conversation in it that is just little bits of color or reactive little bits of music. And so I think there's a very big difference of what works well with choir and what works well for Kingsingers. And I think also, of course, Kingsingers, the range level is quite compact as opposed to a choir. And you have a number of voices, 6 in this case, within quite a small range, actually. And that delivers a different kind of sound world. And it's a world that, of course, everyone's very familiar with and very and loves, but acquires kind of range pattern is slightly larger. Having said that, because I know that you talk a lot about, and we did when I was in the group too, but when composers wrote for us, about the kind of range spectrum that they used, because it's something I think as a composer one has to think about a lot. What is, firstly, what are comfortable keys for singers to sing in, and what is the character of the key, and how does this key work well for voices? I find there are some keys that are very difficult for voices, actually. It doesn't matter whether it's king singers or whether it's a choir. And one of the worst keys that I've ever come across is E major. And I can remember doing a piece with the BBC Singers, actually, by a very eminent British composer. We recorded it. It was in E major. It was a filthy piece to get into. And it was a very, very difficult piece to sing. And you realize, one of the reasons you realize is because sopranos and tenors don't like singing near their break. Now, I'm sure, Julian, you will know more about this than I do as a crummy singer, but E, F, F sharp, that area for a tenor and a soprano is very, very difficult to sing in, and it has to be navigated very, very carefully. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, definitely, absolutely. Treat with caution. Yes,
exactly. So, funnily enough, if you write a piece in E flat major, a semitone lower, which is of course a completely different character of a key, going from E flat to F to G is much easier. That kind of transition for higher singers is much easier, and it's very strange in that regard. So I would caution composers to think about keys very carefully. Now, a lot of singers, I'm writing a song cycle at the moment for a very eminent British singer who has a wonderful range, but the reality is most singers, and she said the same thing to me, you like to sing most of what you're going to sing within a very comfortable range. I think it's fair to say that it would be the same with the king singers. You want to sing within a comfortable range for most of the piece.
Well, you've taken the words out of our mouths. I think if anyone's watching has looked at the information pack for the New Music Prize, you'll see that we have a range chart for the 6 king singers within it. And the range chart shows not only kind of the extremes of what we want to sing. Now, they're the extremes within reason. I think most of us can still sing higher or lower than there, but we choose not to put it there because it's not particularly useful for me to put down that I can say sing a bottom bottom-B, because it doesn't really need to be at a piece. So if it exists already, if we decide to tackle the Rachmaninoff, I'll do my best. But the full range is kind of what we think is sort of an appropriate range to give. And then we have our working range, we've called it. Now, our working range is where we feel most comfortable singing for a long period of time. So we're doing a 2-hour concert. If 70 to 80% is within that working range, I think for me, that's a bottom E flat to a G or an A. That's really lovely. Then I know that I'm not going to strain my voice. It's not going to be difficult. And then when I have moments when I go outside that range, it's no problem. And with a group like ours, where everyone is so closely set, there's no reason that we should have to go outside that, because there's someone else very close to you normally who can sing that. And for us, a kind of a hallmark of a piece that hasn't necessarily thought about the voices is particularly when you've got, say, in the first countertenor part, so with Patrick, say, if you've got someone who is just constantly writing top F sharps, like I think a top F sharp or a top G is the top of his range chart. But if you have like 50% of the piece sits above an E, then it could be a brilliant piece of composition, but is it a brilliant piece of composition for the king singers? Probably not. So I think that what you're saying there about like really focusing on the range that is comfortable for the individuals or for the group is a really, really key part of this.
Yes, I agree. I don't think it matters whatever type of singer you are. If you're working within your comfort zone, most of the time, the singer is much more able to construct the line. And the soprano, for instance, might have a top A at the end, but they know how to navigate those top notes based on the way that they position their voice for the majority of the piece. If you're up on a high, as you say, a high note all the time, you have to completely change the kind of positioning of where your voice is, and that can be very, very uncomfortable for the singer. And actually, if you do that for one piece and then have to sing another piece, which is a completely different kind of concept, you can be in a very, very difficult position vocally. And I think it's an extremely important thing to think about with singers. It doesn't make any difference how skilled or otherwise the singer is. I remember a long time ago I had singing lessons with a man who lived in Italy, and he had some singing lessons with a singer called Tito Gobbi, a very, very famous Italian singer. And he heard Caruso sing, and he said, the great thing about Caruso was he sang at a comfortable level. He didn't sing loud, but he sang at a comfortable level. And then when he sang big notes or high notes, which don't come so often in arias, he could navigate his way to those notes, and of course they sounded wonderful because you hadn't been listening to that all the time, and you kind of got to give an illusion for the listener that and so if you have a high point, it's better if that high point comes as a high point and nothing more. I did a premiere of a piece, the BBC. I did a premiere by a very famous English composer who came, and a lovely man, but he wrote very, very high soprano parts. The singers were, they were beside themselves with agony. And because, they were trying their hardest and they were very good singers, but it was just too much to demand of the singers. So I think it's something to really, really take care with.
Well, can I just jump in and say two little quick things? Judith Bingham wrote a piece for us in 1971, which was called Riddles, and the group never performed it. One of the reasons that we've worked with her recently to get this piece, Tricksters, written is because it took a lot of the same content, but it developed it and kind of remodeled it for the group of 2019, 2020, but didn't lose sight of what the original piece was, or some of the motifs that were in it. But she said there were two things that were about it. One, she was 21 and she said she delivered it late and it wasn't enough time for it to be ready. But secondly, she imagined that all altos were like her with an enormous range. And so she had the countertenors going up to top A flats the whole time. And the group was just like, oh, we've got to perform this at a festival in King's Lynn. We simply cannot sing this piece. So I think that's the first thing. It's like not all basses have my range, not all tenors have Julian's range. So if you're thinking about, say, the SATB categories, think about like what is a reasonable range to expect from someone in this voice part rather than what do I sing. And I think that the other thing which I would be, I just from my experience in the King Singers, we often transpose pieces so they fit our ranges best. And three of the keys we go into very often are E flat, D, and D flat, because we can very comfortably sing four tonics. I can sing the bottom one down towards like my lowest note, and Pat can very comfortably, within his comfortable range, sing the same note three octaves higher. So you can have a really texturally rich thing which isn't compromised at either end. And so I think that, we've given the range chart, and it'll be interesting just to think about how is it that they can kind of honor the tonality as well as possible, if I choose this key over that key, for instance.
Yes.
One more thing that I would add. Sorry, Bob. One more quick thing I'd add is just that I think when people write for us, sometimes they think, okay, it's the King Singers, right? They can do, more advanced things than a lot of groups. So we'll give them, we'll sort of make it a little bit more complex and technically demanding. But actually, sometimes it's just the simplicity, the simple pieces within that comfort range, which actually we can bring the best side out of, and they're often the most rewarding ones in a way, perhaps.
I totally agree with that, Julian, because actually, from a compositional point of view too, writing something simple is one of the hardest things to do, because you have to be very, very clear in using everything you can in the most effective way. And I think what you say is really important, because another aspect of that also is, it's like with orchestration, writing for orchestra. You use instrument based on the sort of color you want to have. And it's the same with writing for voices. You articulate the color of the piece based with the instruments that you have. So that means, certainly as far as the King Singers is concerned, as much as a choir, you think very carefully about how you score it. And you give people plenty of time to take breaths, to have space, and also, if the voice isn't needed, don't use it. It's a bit like saying, I've got to have clarinets here because they haven't played for 40 bars. Let them wait another 10. If it's about thinking about the impact of the scoring. And I think that's a very, very important aspect of writing for a group like the King Singers, because there's the one thing that you do have within quite a compact range is such a variety of color. So I think thinking about that is important. What is the function of this part, and how is it functioning with the other parts? And also not being afraid to cut things right down if that's what's demanded of the text. And I think there's a lot of music you do where the group sings in two parts. You might have just two voices. So think very carefully about the scoring and about the impact of how that is working. And I think it's the same for a choir as well. Very important aspect.
Well, it reminds me of a very good friend of mine, is a director, a film director, and she, when watching things by sort of maybe younger nascent directors, she can often tell how experienced or comfortable they are in their own skin by how frequently they feel the need to deploy tricks. Like sometimes she'll if she watches a short film, she might say, "Oh, I can tell that person was young because they did everything in 15 minutes." Do you know what I mean? They felt they needed to showcase everything they could possibly do in 15 minutes. And actually, if you do three things incredibly well, and let the audience enjoy them in a way that isn't overwhelming, that could be much more effective than doing a whistle-stop tour of all 20 things you can do, but you get 10 seconds of each, and it's a bit of a kind of an affront on the senses, perhaps. So I that resonates with me enormously, this idea of actually the kind of the beauty in perhaps not overworking or making everything overwrought.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, Johnny. What you said is also very important, because one of the hardest things as a composer, you have a good idea and you use that idea, and then you think, what am I going to do now? You know, that I actually, so many people I've talked to about composing will say, I had this great idea and I started writing and then I didn't know what to do next. Well, the fact is that another thing I've heard so many composers say is use as little material as you can, because actually there's a tremendous amount that you can do with a very small amount of material. And I've found that if you look at a composer like Henry Purcell, for instance, who I like very much, who he uses, he gets such a lot out of very, very small resources. And often when you restrict the resource that you have, your creativity becomes greater. So there isn't a there isn't a need to have too many ideas. You know, often you hear something and you think, I wish I'd heard that again. You know, sometimes an idea or something a musical idea you suggest, you put it over, and then you might sing exactly the same thing again, or maybe slightly altered, just simply because actually people need to hear things more than once, because actually what you have, that idea has got to be taken on a journey. So what you say is absolutely right. Keep your material, restrict the material, and use it to the best that you can.
Well, there's a question here, which was earlier. It was from Linda Purves, and it said, "Hi from Canada. Is there a danger of a gesture becoming a gimmick?" And I think we the word gesture isn't exactly what we're talking about here, but I think what you're saying here is completely relevant. Actually, it's the case. It may become a gimmick if it's done too much, but actually repetition is no bad thing. Like actually giving something time to really kind of live in the ears of the listener, for them to be able to digest it, knowing that it's like one small course, maybe in a concert of 30 small courses, you know, like, and actually if you have too much variation within it, then, you know, like how does it differ from the things around it as well? But, you know, I liked her question, is there a danger of a gesture becoming a gimmick?
Yes.
Yeah.
I see what you mean, and it is a good question. I think if the kind of the idea is honest and it really responds to what the piece is trying to convey, then I wouldn't see it necessarily would be a gimmick. It would be something that would be a statement, in a sense, that you kind of yes, that can recur. I mean, I think too, and this is something I've thought about quite a lot in terms of musical shape, and certainly when things are sung, I've thought a lot about refrains, or about you know, choruses. Popular song, or in well, Schubert was quite good on refrains too, but you know, there is for me, refrains have a wonderfully democratic function, in that if you think of well, for instance, as an example, Somewhere Over the Rainbow, you know, somewhere over the rainbow, that is the refrain, it's the chorus. It actually, a lot of people know songs because of the refrain. And if you'd say, well, what is the verse? They say, well, I haven't got a clue. The chorus has a way of identifying for the listener the song. And I think there's a tremendous power in chorus refrains, because they bring people together, and it's often the point of the song that everyone knows. And I like that concept. I use refrain a lot actually, because I think it's a way of hooking people into an idea of community, and I think singing, for me, that's what it's all about. So you look at ways of musically defining community for people, and I think refrain does that. So I think when Julian was talking about simplicity, I think that is an area of simplicity which shouldn't be overlooked. No composer has overlooked the idea of repetitive refrain and strophic kind of nature of songs, which are verse, chorus, verse, chorus, verse, chorus.
That's what I was going to say. I mean, like if you look at kind of the structure of kind of so many pop songs, which we naturally find catchy and which we listen to, there's usually get at least 4 choruses, don't you? You get verse, chorus, bridge, chorus. Like,
yes.
I just did a really strange amount of counting on this hand, but there's usually 4 choruses, right? And so if we're talking about actually, that usually doesn't feel like it's too much, does it? We feel like we actually finally start to know the song the first time we're hearing it when we get to chorus 3 or 4. So given that most of the time people come to a concert, they don't hear a piece having heard it 1,800 times before. They might be hearing it for the first time. Giving them something that might feel like a chorus, whether it's just returning to a sound world or something a number of times, I think does give that sense of familiarity and acquiescence in a new musical idea that they need to get it.
Yes, I agree with that, and one mustn't also forget that a little bridge, it can be a very short bridge that it can be. It can be the hub of the song. It can be the thing that actually you listen to most, because it's the one little thing that's different. I think that's something to consider as well.
Well, can I add in a question here? This is from Stefan. I think, or it's Stéphane Vercouilly, I think is your name, if I said that properly. And his question is, I find it difficult sometimes to join chunks of music to make them progress smoothly from one to another. And sometimes just thinking logically how chords could go from one another can give an overall impression of something getting flat all of a sudden. And actually, do you have any advice for how you construct these transitions or these bridges? How do you, because I imagine that you don't come up with the bridge first.
No.
Yeah.
No, I think a bridge can be a very useful tool if you want to use repetitive music, but also between different. It depends, I suppose, if these chunks of music are in the same key or in a different key. I've found that. In most cases, if you've got a fairly short song, maybe 3 or 4 minutes, and your song is in a particular key, you really want to end that song in the same key. There's something slightly uncomfortable sometimes for the listener, something slightly unfinished if you end up in a different key, even though perhaps they might not be musical. The listener has some sort of instinct for where home is in a piece if you start in a particular key. And so in that case, the bridge can be a way of taking you maybe to a middle section, which is in a different key. And then you've got to find a little way to get back to the to home again, and that can often be quite enjoyable, because you've got to kind of construct harmonic passages. It's like sort of trying to find a little light way to the way through to the next place. I would advise, I've forgotten the name of the question, I'm so sorry, to have a bit of courage with that, and try and find your way, take you somewhere else, but then find a way to bring yourself back home again. That could be one way of, because when a song finishes in a different key or in a different arena, it has an unfinished quality about it. Maybe in some cases that's what you want, but in general, I think we need to follow that kind of journey of starting at home, going somewhere else, going through a few journeys, and then coming back home.
Wonderful, thank you. There are a couple more questions which I'd really love us to get to here. I know we don't have much longer. There's one which has just disappeared, which is infuriating from if I look at the chat, but I think I can remember it. So Jim Bergston asked it, and I hope I phrase this correctly, but it was on the subject of kind of political correctness, but slightly more on kind of trendiness and about. I want to ask this both in the context of themes and content, but also in terms of I don't know, musical ideas. So that there's a to use a musical idea. So that obviously there's a huge movement in classical music, or there has been for the last 20 years, of kind of like composing within kind of cluster chord sound worlds. In the same way that in the last 5 years in pop music, there's been it's called the millennial whoop, which blows my mind. But it's when you go from the third to the dominant in pop songs, that sort of features in an inordinate number of pop songs and gets heard more. Both thematically and also musically, do you think it's more important to try and do things which the world seems to want, or is it more important to try and compose the thing that you want to compose, maybe even if that's not necessarily what everyone else is doing?
Yeah, I would say the latter without a doubt, because there is a perceived, there are lots of perceived sound worlds that have been around for a long time, and I think over the last 20 years, I think there's a lot of slow music. I think that's just the nature of our times. I think if you look from the time when John Taverner and Arvo Pärt and Henryk Górecki, that whole revolution of big wide sounds, slow moving sounds really took hold. And I think to a certain extent we're still in that. Ironically, it does seem to offer something to a sort of contemporary world. I think a lot of it to do is because our world is so visual. So we see things in a much more filmic way, I think, than we used to. Maybe we see things on a broader picture, like we do landscapes or big pictures. I like rhythmic impulse. So for me, I found that I'm drawn to that quite a lot. So I'm just, from my point of view, I tend to try and respond to what I think the text requires or what the piece requires, even though it might not be trendy or, trendy and me are not, we're not.
Don't you dare say that about yourself, Bob. That's a lie. That's a lie.
But you, to a certain extent too, one has to tread one's own path. And I think there is a huge temptation to want to try and fit into the kind of contemporary mode, but I think one has to respond to one's instincts, I think, and I think you'll get a much truer representation of what you're trying to achieve that way.
Jim has just asked again, like a simpler version of the question can also be like, is it better to write something that's more accessible or something that's more challenging? And I think my gut response is that there is definitely space for both. I I talk specifically now to allegorize or analogize. I'm going to talk about like the spin classes I often do. There is a huge market for people who want something which is a good workout, and there is a smaller market for people who want something which is very, very difficult. But that market exists, and the trade-off is you might get something which is, you might get choirs that are really able to push themselves, which they might not be able to do with other things, but it won't be done so often. Whereas, if you have something more accessible, it is accessible, more people might do it. So I suppose as a composer, I imagine you have to think about, like, do I want my works to be sung by as many people as possible, or do I want to cater to, I don't know, real specialists in a particular craft who can do this? And I know it's going to be more rarefied, but perhaps a more extraordinary thing.
Yes, I totally get what Jim is saying. I think that, well, one has to respond to one's own character in that respect. But I think, like you, music has to be a journey. So it has to be, we have to aspire to want to push more. I think, actually, ironically, I think in many respects, excuse me, popular music, has been more, it's pushed things forward more than maybe we have in classical music, in the sense that classical music, the extremely difficult end of classical music has become slightly disengaged from the discourse, and I'm sorry about that, because when I was a young singer singing in London, in the 70s, late 70s and early 80s, contemporary classical music was very, very much loved, and because it was all about ideas. And I think we've lost that, and I slightly regret that, because that it was a very exciting going, because it's a very important part of our musical world. And groups like the King's Singers, you can sing that music. You can sing the harder end music. And a lot of people, maybe who don't sing to the same level that you do, they like to do it too. And that's really good. So I think we need to keep that argument alive. And, accessibility is a very broad word, because it's sort of, one kind of thinks, accessible to what? Is it accessible to someone's inability to want to look further than just something very basic? Or so I think it's a big word, and so I think we need to keep pushing in whatever way we can, because singing is not easy. So we need to push also the argument that we need to expect more and get better and sing better and be more ambitious. And so I think that's a good question, and I hope that's answered it from my perspective in some sort of way.
Well, just one very quick question, Bob, which just a question in from Chindu Kuravilla, which I think it's not related exactly to what we're talking about now, but I think it's quite an important one, maybe just to help those people out there who'd value an answer on this. So how do you decide when and which particular voice is soloed out during a portion of the music while the other parts accompany or hum? I think this is quite an interesting one, because I think a lot of arrangers or composers out there, perhaps, how do you go about deciding which voice to highlight, if at all?
Yeah, that is a good question, because I think certainly one of the defining aspects of the King's Singers in general is that it's always been a group expression. You get solo voices that do come out, but I think it's very much a group perspective. I remember when a lot of vocal groups have solo and accompaniment all the way through, which can be great. I'm not such a big fan of that kind of style. I like the idea where you mix the texture. It becomes harder when you're singing very personal songs that have a very kind of intimate message. It becomes harder for a group to identify. It becomes harder for a group to identify that kind of message successfully. Excuse me. And so I think that if I think of an arrangement, you know, that you sing of mine, and so it goes, which is, you know, a solo song, very, very intimate. It had to have a group expression, but then you get a solo that comes out of it. In that sense, it had to have a point where the texture was broken up. I think instinctively one maybe looks at within a song and finds a point at which the texture has to be broken up. If you have, particularly if you have a slow moving song and you have homophonic texture maybe for long periods of time, I would say it kind of dictates it itself in one way. I hope that's helpful. I think that you have to have a sense too of what kind of voice, what kind of color and timbre of voice you want to express a particular point in the text, and that will only dictate itself to the person who's writing it at the particular time. But I think that is a good question actually. But I personally wouldn't be so interested in just solo and accompaniment, because then that, in a way, unless it's kind of doo-wop where the accompaniment has a very specific function, the function of who is accompanying becomes a little bit nebulous and a little bit unclear.
Thank you so much. I think before we go, I'm going to just ask you one last thing, which is this. Hopefully lots of people who are listening today or watching today are going to be entering the New Music Prize. If you were to give them one final parting piece of wisdom or advice, what would it be?
The most important thing in my mind is that you have to be yourself. Don't be afraid to be yourself. It's the hardest thing to do as a composer, as any creative person, is to have the courage to be yourself. Because what you do, each person will be completely different from what someone else has done. And you have to have the courage to be who you are. That would be my one bit of advice.
Thank you so much. Bob, this has been an absolute treat from Jules and I and all the King Singers. Thank you so much for taking some time this Saturday in August, when it thankfully is raining outside. So hopefully you're not missing out too much on the weather, but to share your wisdom with us and with everyone else who's joining us. It's been so wonderful to spend some time with you, to hear everything you have to say. And we do hope that as many of you who've been here today will enter the New Music Prize. Next week, we have our next session. It's going to be with Valérie Saint-Agathe, and she is the director of the San Francisco Girls Choir, but it's particularly about writing for young voices, right? Writing for children's choirs and children's voices, and which may be of incredible use, not only for the category here, which is for writing for a children's choir, but also in understanding maybe how we can write in a way that is accessible, that is still engaging and doesn't undermine the musical craft, but is something which we can engage with, perhaps if we're newer to music or newer to singing. It should be wonderful. She will be joined by Pat and Bruiser, or Chris Brereton, who don't know him as Bruiser, as you should do, because that's what everyone calls him. And otherwise, we wish you a wonderful day. I've treated this a bit like a symposium, to be honest, over here. I've been drinking my glass of wine as we've been going. There's a little bit left, which I will finish now. Bob, Jules, I hope you have wonderful evenings ahead.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Johnny. Thank you, Julian. And thank you, everyone, for taking part in this. It's a real journey composing a piece of music, and I would encourage you to enter this competition, because it's a wonderful competition, and it's you have to have the courage to do it, and do it with your heart.
Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day, everyone, and see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks.
you. Bye, everyone.